Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of Introduction to Latin America and the Caribbean 1. So, we're going to move the discussion further today. So, as you see, we have so far discussed the dynamic of conquest and the dynamics of the establishment of colonial rule through a colonial government in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is roughly the period, between 1492, the arrival of Christopher Columbus, and the end of the 16th century. So like all the way through the 1590s. Well, the vice kingdoms, the viceroys, the captaincies were starting to function in Latin America and the Caribbean on behalf of the Spanish crown and Portuguese crown mostly. And now we want to see some topics in this colonial society in the making, right? So we're going to talk about the economy, we're going to talk about labor, we're going to talk about population, race, family, education, and many other issues. And it's mostly with the intention of describing how this society worked in Latin America and the Caribbean. If you think from the period of like the moment when Columbus arrived and the Spaniards, Portuguese, and other Europeans arrived all the way to the present, Latin American countries have lived most of their time under colonial rule than republican rule, right? Like the republics of this region are 200 years old, whereas the colonial period in Latin America and the Caribbean lasted 300 plus years, right? So we want to see like this very long-standing and in many ways very stable society, like what characteristics it had, right? And today, in particular, we're going to talk about population and labor. And when we talk about population, the first thing we have to talk about this is what you see in these pictures. I want you to look at these pictures and see in the skins. So these are indigenous drawings from the Aztec Empire, right? At the moment of conquest and the years after conquest. And you can see the smallpox in the skins of the people in this picture, right? Like here he's dying, these two are already dead, and you can see how the person who drew them portrays here how they were succumbing to what we know today is it's smallpox mostly. But they didn't know what kind of disease that was. And this is very important because this introduction of diseases and the pandemics that they brought are going to change entirely the population, the demographic profile of Latin America and the Caribbean. So let's talk about the colonial society's population. What was going on in terms of the population in Latin America and the Caribbean in the years after conquest and establishment of a colonial government in the region? So remember when we talk about the encounter in the very first session, that we were talking about three main regions, three main groups, three main cultures that kind of got together in this colonial society. We had Africa, we had America, and we had Europe. And what we want to see is what happened with the population of all of these, every of these three regions when they came together in the Americas. So let's just start with the indigenous population. So the most important dynamic of the indigenous population is going to be demographic collapse. You're going to have a very high, right, population that is decreasing steadily over the 16th century. And while the indigenous population is going down because of warfare, because of diseases, because of slavery, and many others, the Spanish population is going up, right? Conquistadors are going to expand mostly through immigration, right? Um, think of the first people who came to the Americas is going to be mostly men, military men, who migrate, searching for wealth and others, and then later, as we're going to see, through natural reproduction. So we have indigenous demographic collapse, and then we have the significant increase of the Spanish population. And then when the Atlantic slave trade was said, we're going to discuss that next week. But basically, just to give you a number, around 12 million Africans were brought to the Americas in a period of almost 200 years, right? So that's the other population that's going to increase significantly, but it's not going to stay at the same number because of the dynamics of slavery and how harsh it was for the enslaved Africans, particularly in places where they have to work for in sugar plantations, right? So you have these three groups, one decreasing and the other one increasing, but then you're going to have marriages, right, and connection between all of these. They're going to create new cultural identities. Probably the best known one is mestizo, right? Mestizo was the son of a Spanish and an indigenous. But then you have castizo, mulatto, sambo, like many others. You can see in these pictures, a picture I posted in this PowerPoint presentation, like every single one of those is a classification created by the Spanish crown to account for the duties and rights of every subject in their kingdom in the Americas. And that depended on who were your parents, on your blood, right? Where, how much of a Spanish you were, how much of an indigenous person you were, how much of an African you were. So now let's break this down in parts. Uh, let's talk about the indigenous demographic collapse. The name itself tells you, like, the kind of situation we're dealing with. Like, demographic collapse is like a total collapse of the population of a region. Again, because of slavery, because of smallpox, and many others. You can see here in another picture, right? The person with all the like the parts of the smallpox, right? All throughout their skin, like again, like they didn't know precisely where they were portraying, but we know today, when we look at these pictures, that what they're portraying is a huge pandemic of smallpox that ravaged the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries. So when we talk about demographic collapse, we have first to think of, or the first question we have to ask is, how many people was living in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans? We know there's registers of people living here, more than 10 and 15,000 years ago. There's many theories about like how people got here, one's from Asia, one's from the Pacific, right? But the fact is like there is a very long history of human presence in the Americas. And the question of exactly how many people lived at the moment of conquest is very hard to answer for many reasons. The first one is that we have very few sources. Not all indigenous communities had writing systems. We know the Aztecs and the Mayas, for instance, had writing systems. But many other indigenous societies in the continent didn't have a writing system that we can go to looking for archival material that tell us, okay, how many people lived there. And in the cases that there was written material, such as the case of the Aztecs, for instance, it was very heavily destroyed by the Spanish conquistadors. It was processed by the Spanish conquistadors as, witchcraft, as documents against the Catholic faith, as an attack on their faith. Remember, the Catholic Church had a very, very important role in in the expansion of European colonial rule. And they were like friars and priests and missionaries were some of the people who were mostly in charge of destroying the few sources that we have. So that said, like all we can do really is speculate. We know every single part of the continent was inhabited. We know there were areas where there was very heavily concentrated urban settlements, right? Cities. Well, like that was the case of the Mayas, was the case of the Incas, the Muiscas, the Aztecs in different parts of the Americas. But historians have been doing this work of trying to calculate how many people might have lived right before conquest, and they have come from uh, anywhere from 8 to 100 million people. We know places like Tenochtitlan were probably just the city around 300,000 people in 1519, which placed it as one of the largest cities in the world. But just again, it's very hard to calculate. We don't have the sources, but it could be as low as 8, but also as high as 100. And I personally think it was closer to the 100 because of the kind of reports we have. We don't have the numbers, but we have the reports of continuous human habitation for hundreds and thousands of years in the region before European conquest. And what's going to mark this demographic collapse more than anything else is the expansion of diseases, particularly smallpox. Remember, as I was mentioning when we discussed conquest, that smallpox actually reached the Aztecs and reached the Incas even before conquest actually happened. When the Spanish soldiers arrived to fight the Incas in what today is Peru, most of their army was already decimated because of smallpox. And the same thing is going to happen when they lay siege on the city of Tenochtitlan in 1521. So the demographic collapse of the indigenous population comes mostly from smallpox. But then you, of course, are going to have a portion of the population that survives, but they have to fight, they have to fly, they're forced to migrate, and this is going to alter the demographic map of colonial society. So basically, you're going to find dynamics of concentration of the survivors in one point, but also many of the survivors are just going to run away to new locations, and that's going to disperse essentially the indigenous population. So that was the discussion of our first group, indigenous peoples. But now we move to Europe, right? Particularly to Iberian settlers, to Portuguese and Spanish settlers. And as I told you, if the main characteristic of the indigenous population in this period is the demographic collapse is dramatically going down, the Iberian settlers are going to have exactly the opposite dynamic. They're constantly increasing. So initially, you're going to have mostly men, right? As I told you, people like Cortés, like Pizarro, the conquistadors, they were military men. So, like the first wave of migrants from Europe to the Americas is going to be mostly soldiers. In many cases, they were actually convicted fellows, right? Felons. Um, Prisoners, people who were freed from prison just because they agreed to go to the Americas and take part in the conquest. But then, right after a colonial government is established, you're going to have the migration of more people. You have artisans, professionals, clerics, women, children. Like it's a more robust and diverse movement of Iberian settlers from Spain and Portugal into the Americas. And that means that the increase of the Spanish and Portuguese population is not going to happen through immigration only, right? That means just not only from people traveling from Spain and settling in the Americas, but you're going to have natural reproduction. Remember that if one of these military men, like Pizarro, as he actually did, had children with an indigenous woman, his children are going to be mestizos, not Spanish, not white, right? It's a different social, legal, and racial classification. So if you wanted to have a purely 100% Spanish white child, you had to have your child with a Spanish person, right? But if you only had military men, that was not going to happen. But when you have a larger migration, when you have also women arriving, Spanish women arriving in the Americas, we can see the expansion and growth of the Iberian population also through natural reproduction. So it's people coming here, but also you're going to have a new figure, which is people born to both Spanish parents, right? But they are born in the Americas. And that distinction is going to play out very importantly by the end of our class when we talk about the independence. And the largest concentration of the Spanish population in the Americas is going to be mostly in two cities, Mexico City and Lima in Peru. And then, after we discuss the indigenous population, the European population, now we have to talk about the African population. And the arrival of Africans to the Americas is, of course, strictly connected to labor demands, right? Because they were brought as enslaved labor. The demand of labor increased. Remember, you have to keep in mind the demographic collapse of the indigenous population, like dramatically going down. So the Spanish settlers, the Portuguese settlers are left without a source of labor. They want people to work for them. And that's precisely when the African population comes into play in this discussion of conquest, because the labor demand increased, right? And Iberians start bringing enslaved Africans to America. Of course, that means that most Africans in the continent are going to be enslaved, but many are actually managed to gain their freedom. That could be bought, that could be given, like we're going to see that later. But there is also, and substantially by the 17th and 18th century, you're going to have a large free people of color population in many areas of the continent. But of course, the history of the migration dynamics and population dynamics of the African people in the Americas is very much connected to slavery. And in many regions of Latin America and the Caribbean of the continent, Africans and their descendants are going to constitute most of the population, right? As already told you, the example of Brazil, right? Brazil has the largest African descendant population of the world for a country outside of Africa, because precisely, because of precisely the arrival of millions of Africans through the Atlantic slave trade that were brought by the Portuguese settlers, Portuguese crown in general, to work in the sugar plantations. So that's pretty much the three dynamics we have, again, in terms of population: the increase of the Iberian population, the increase of the African population, and the collapse of the indigenous population because of the early dynamics of colonialism in the region. And now, to finish our discussion for today, let's talk about labor. As I mentioned today, like, we're going to talk about population and population and labor are very closely connected. Like, as I mentioned, the arrival of Africans just happened because of the demographic collapse of the indigenous population, which meant that the indigenous population could not work anymore for the European settlers. So let's see who was doing the work, right, in this kind of society. Because I told you, we can think of this as a sort of encounter, right? We have the indigenous population, the African population, and the European population, but it's not an equal relationship. The European population is at the top, and the indigenous and African population and like all the mixed population are right in the middle. So who was doing most of the work, the labor? It was, of course, the indigenous population and the African population. In terms of the indigenous population, uh, in the Spanish Empire, even though there was a fast establishment of slavery relations, like, which means that the Spanish settlers enslaved indigenous population. After a few decades, indigenous slavery was outlawed, but that doesn't mean that forced labor ceased to exist, right? The use of indigenous labor in the Spanish colonies in the Americas is going to be very prominent, particularly in two sectors of the economy, which are agriculture, sugar, and mining, silver. And particularly in mining, places like Potosi, which is a town in Bolivia that has one of the largest reserves of silver in the world. Um, it was exploited for centuries by the Spanish Empire, and most of the labor here is going to be was provided at the moment, of course, by the indigenous population. So what kind of forced labor arrangement we're going to find for the indigenous population in this period in the colonial Latin American and Caribbean society? We have two. In the first case, something called the encomienda. An encomienda was an institution established very early in the colonial period to allocate indigenous labor and land to Iberian conquistadors, right? And the Iberian conquistadors were named encomenderos. This institution of encomienda and encomendero was actually created by the Spanish crown to colonize the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula. Remember when we discussed the reconquest, like the process of expelling the Muslim population from southern Spain, to reconquest, right, to recapture, as they would say back then, what was supposed to be Hispanic Spain. So the encomienda was basically a way of granting, granting a price, a reward for the conquistadors, for the Spanish soldiers and settlers who made all the conquests. And it was basically, we're going to give you this amount of land, and we're going to give you this indigenous population to work it. The encomienda disappears, right, when the viceroys are established as such in the continent. But then you have something called repartimiento or mita. Mita, like the second word you see right here, was actually created by the Inca Empire. It was a rotational labor draft, and the Spanish Empire used it pretty much with the same characteristic, but renamed it repartimiento. And what is this? What is a rotational labor draft? It was very heavily used in the case of the mines, like the one I mentioned to you, Potosi, in present-day Bolivia. And it's basically that every indigenous community had to send a part of their population to work in the mines every year for a certain amount of time for free, right? So they would go, let's say, for 1 month, like This community would have to send, like, 15 working men for 1 month to work in the mines, right? And then the next 15 days, it's another community store, and then another community store. It's a rotational labor draft. While in the case of the Spanish crown, the indigenous slavery was really fast out loud, like it was prohibited. Indigenous slavery persisted in Brazil, in Brazil for many, many years up to the 19th century, even after independence. So all of this to say, of course, most of the dynamics of slavery in colonial Latin America are going to be pushed on the African population, but indigenous slavery didn't disappear altogether um, in the region. And finally, of course, we have enslaved labor, slavery, Atlantic slave trade, right? And if indigenous labor in South America, for instance, was heavily used in mining, the labor of enslaved Africans is going to become very important for one industry in particular, agriculture. And in particular, within like the agricultural sector, for the production of sugar, sugar plantations. Sugar plantations are going to expand in Brazil, are going to expand in the Caribbean. In Colombia, you have sugar plantation. Venezuela, you have sugar plantation. Like in many areas of the region, and sugar plantations were worked by enslaved Africans. So slavery, particularly with the enslaved Africans, prosper where diminished indigenous population could not sustain forced labor, right? So remember the dynamic of population. That's what I told you, population and labor are connected. Because there is a demographic collapse of the indigenous population, the Europeans decide to bring Africans, right? Enslaved Africans to cover that labor demand. Again, we don't know exactly how many people was moved, like kidnapped, captured in Africa and forced to work in the Americas, but the estimate of historians today was around 12 million people in a period of 200 plus years that were enslaved and shipped to the Americas. Of course, this is huge. And the other part, when we go back to the discussion of population of this, is the impact this kind of demographic change is going to have in Africa itself, right? Because who was captured to work as a slave? As we can see in the records, in the history books, in most of the cases, going to be men, right? Men between like we would consider boys today, of course, like between the ages of 13, 12, all the way to 21, 25, when they're in their prime age to be captured and sold in the slave markets in the Americas. So when you take mostly the male population from the Africa to the Americas, you're going to have a gender imbalance as well in Africa. And enslaved Africans, of course, lived in very difficult conditions. They lived in small houses. They had minimal access to clothing, to food, to culture and education, and many, many others. There's places actually in the United States where you can visit what used to be slave plantations. For instance, in New Orleans, which at some point was one of the most important slave ports in the Americas. You can go on the river to many plantations to see what was like, the life of slave people like. So with this, we close the discussion that I was telling you, which is about population and labor. What happened with the demographic profile of Latin America and the Caribbean after conquest, and um, who was doing most of the work.